Welcome to this edition of Go Vote Omaha, presented by the League of Women Voters of Greater Omaha. The League of Women Voters is a nonpartisan organization and does not endorse political candidates or parties. The League does, however, take positions on issues. Our purpose is to empower voters and defend democracy. Go Vote Omaha primarily focuses on policy issues, and as a result of our discussions, we hope you will feel ready to make informed decisions at election time. I'm Candide Santiago, Director of Operations for the League of Women Voters of Greater Omaha, and your host for today's program. Today we are talking to our friends from the League of Women Voters of Nebraska and OpenSky Policy Institute about the recent special session and what happens because or in spite of it. Joining us today is Vice President of Action for the League of Women Voters of Nebraska, Rachel Gibson, and Rebecca Firestone, Executive Director of OpenSky Policy Institute. Thank you both for being here. To begin, could you please tell us what each of your organizations do and how each of you are involved during legislative sessions? Rebecca, we can start with you.
Sure, thank you so much. So it's such a pleasure to be here today. Thank you so much for the invitation. OpenSky Policy Institute is a nonpartisan, nonprofit policy research organization with a mission of advancing evidence-based policies that help everyone in Nebraska thrive.
Thank you. Rachel?
Yes, the League of Women Voters of Nebraska is very closely related to the League of Women Voters of Greater Omaha. Our focus is really on policy level issues. So whereas a lot of the local leagues do voter registration and things like that, the state league really looks at all the different legislation coming through and helping folks make their voice heard that way.
And we appreciate the work you do with that. How is the special session different from a regular legislative session, and how is it similar? This is our first question, and Rebecca, I'd love to give it to you.
I think I'm
going to
Rachel to actually kick off as the electoral process specialist.
Special session. So,
yes, please.
So special session is time when our legislature meets outside of their regular legislating time. So the way our legislature is set up, they meet in the spring, and that's when they pass bills and do things like that, and then they're out of session for the rest of the year. So special sessions can be called by the governor or a group of legislators when there is something that is pressing that they feel can't wait until the regular session in the spring. And so that's what a special session is. They usually are called when something is time sensitive or something big has happened. So for example, we had one about redistricting a few years ago because census data was late. We couldn't wait to redraw our maps until later. When there was the big dip in the economy and in the late 2000s, before the 10s, our budget changed. So we needed to immediately get in there and make some adjustments. So that is what a special session is. It's usually called for one specific topic, and they're usually short and sweet and to the point, but they do function a little bit different than a regular session.
Great, thank you. Our next question is, why was this special session called? And anyone can jump in at these questions.
I think Rebecca's going to take the more policy-focused one.
Sure. So I can start on this one. So the current governor has made a real focus since his campaign on property taxes. So it's an issue that gets a lot of thought and consideration in policy circles in Nebraska. Is a real challenge with increases in land valuations, housing prices, agricultural land. And this is something that's been going on for a number of years. Governor Pillen has been really interested in trying to focus efforts at the state level to be able to reduce property taxes. And at the beginning of this year, at the start of the regular session, the governor introduced a number of policy proposals to try to increase the amount of property tax relief that the state was directing to property owners and address the rapid increases in property values in the states, in the state. And in the regular session, it was not possible to pass the property tax relief packages that had initially been proposed. We can talk a little bit more about that. So at the end of the regular session, the governor basically committed to calling a special session to really focus on property taxes. And so that was the impetus for the special session that we just had, was that in the regular session, the legislature did not end up taking action on property taxes to the extent that the governor was looking for, and so wanted to come back in a special session.
So going off of that, our next question reads, why was property tax relief the main focus of this session? Which I know you kind of explained a little bit.
Sure. So there's a background to this issue in that the challenge of increases in how much property tax is being collected in the state is something that has been going on for a number of years. There have been a number of efforts, like certainly I think starting with the Heinemann administration and into the Ricketts administration, of efforts to extend the amount of property tax relief that the state was directing to property owners. And so this was a continuation of that under the Pillen administration. And again, the bill that was passed, that was designed to provide property tax relief in the regular session, was LB 388, and it failed right at the tail end of the regular session. There weren't enough votes to pass that bill, so the governor wanted to sort of pick it up and sort of carry the momentum forward into a special session. In the lead up to the special session and then during the special session, there was a lot of conversation about whether or not a special session was the right mechanism for the scope of property tax relief that Governor Pillen had been calling for. He had started out at the beginning of the year at looking at about a 40% reduction in the amount of property taxes that were collected. Going into special session was looking more at a 50% reduction in how much property tax was collected over time, with an intent that we would see a tax shift in the state, so that we would go from a certain amount of dollars being collected via property taxes, that instead those dollars would be collected through a variety of different sales taxes as a way to get property taxes down.
Thank you. Our next question is, what kind of bills were introduced and which ones actually made it to the floor?
So this was an interesting one, and where I understand that this is different than previous special sessions. Initially, there were three main bills that were really focused on, and those were introduced on behalf of the governor. So there was one that was kind of the tax bill that was heard in the Revenue Committee, and that, as Rebecca mentioned, was the adjustment in how we do sales tax and getting rid of some exemptions, things like that. So there was the tax piece. The other two bills were in appropriations, so that's looking at our budget and how we're spending. And so one of those bills adjusted our current budget cycle, cutting funds, and then the second looks into the future and reduced funding going to certain projects and services. So those were kind of the three main bills. Because the scope of this was so big, property taxes is huge. It touches on so much in our state. And so a lot of senators saw this as an opportunity to bring up some other ideas that approach the tax situation. So what we ended up seeing was over 80 bills introduced, which is quite a few for a special session. And they really just ran the gamut of what they covered. Ultimately, the ideas behind those first three that we talked about are what moved on to the floor.
Okay.
There was also over 20 constitutional amendments
as
well, because the governor issues a call for a special session, and the governor's call coming into this session had 14 points to it. So, and there was a certain amount of scope for interpretation in terms of what would be in scope or out of scope, given the way that the governor's call was structured, and so that led to over 80 bills and 20 constitutional amendments. I think at OpenSky, we were just counting, and I want to say we took a position either through testifying or writing letters on like over 50 bills.
Wow, that's quite a few. That'd be a lot in a regular session.
It would be a lot in a regular session, and it was a lot to do in a special session, because so property taxes are it's a complex issue, right? So an important degree of level setting is just a reminder that property taxes are only collected in Nebraska on the local level. So our schools, our cities, our counties, natural resource districts, fire districts, the state does not collect property taxes. Right. The state does collect income taxes and sales taxes. So if the state is going to take any action to reduce the amount of property tax that is collected, they need to have their own revenues in order to be able to make up the difference about what's collected on the local level by all of those different local governments. So you are, by having the state really seriously focusing on property taxes, it requires you to look at the entire system about how all of our governments in the state of Nebraska collect their revenues and do their business. So it gets pretty complex.
That's a great explanation. Thank you for that. We would love to know, were any bills passed and what did they involve?
So as Rachel said, 80 bills, over 20 constitutional amendments. The bills that ended up passing were LB 34, LB 2, LB 3, and LB 4. So we went from over 80 bills and 20 constitutional amendments to 4 bills passing, and then some debate right at the tail end of the session around LR2CA, which is a constitutional amendment. So LB 34 was the final property tax bill that passed. And what LB 34 does is sort of 3 main things. It increases the total amount of funding available for property tax credits that property owners can claim, an increase of about $185 million. And then it changed the way that property tax credit can be claimed. So previously, if you were a property owner and you wanted to get that relief from the state, you had to pay your property taxes to your school district, and your school collects all your property taxes and uses it to pay for schooling. And then when you were doing your income tax filings before April, you would claim a credit on your income taxes for the amount of property taxes paid. What we've found over the past couple of years, based on data from the Department of Revenue, is that over 50% of property owners who were eligible for that credit weren't claiming the credit. Because not everybody, especially if you don't hire a tax preparer, is going to remember when you're doing your income taxes, oh, I can get some money back on my income taxes because of how much I paid in property taxes. So now that property tax credit is going to be what's called front-loaded. So you will see that property tax credit on your property tax statement when you get it from the counties. So you don't actually have to go do anything with your income taxes. You should see that credit starting from January 1, 2024, showing up on your property tax statement as a reduction in how much property tax you have to pay. The increase in the sort of amount of property tax provided was by about 3%, as opposed to like the 40 or 50% goal that had been started at the beginning of the session. Also, LB 34 establishes a cap on the amount of revenues that cities and counties can collect that's either 0% or the rate of inflation in state and local government expenditures. And that is intended as a break on how much local governments can spend based on how much they are actually allowed to collect in local property taxes. So that was like the property tax relief bill. Then there were the 2 budget bills, LB2 and LB3. Quickly, LB4 was basically just a bill that was passed in order to fund the expenses of special session. This was, I think, the most expensive special session in Nebraska history because of the length and the complexity of it. LB2 cut several parts of the state budget in order to free up some resources to direct into that property tax credit program. And then LB3 changed some other aspects of several different funds that are available to the state budget. There was a certain amount of debate over those 2 budget bills, LB2 and LB3, and a number of senators were arguing that basically you didn't need to change the state's budget in a special session to be able to afford additional property tax relief that was being contemplated of like an increase in $185 million because we were already sitting on a budget surplus of about $500 million. But other senators suggested that the state needs to be trimming back on some of its planned expenditures in order to be able to put more money into property tax relief. So the budget cuts were, I think, on the scope of about $123 million was what finally passed in LB2. There were some notable cuts in there that were a subject of a fair amount of debate. A $15 million cut to the Department of Health and Human Services and a $10 million cut to the Department of Corrections. Both of those were for administration or operational purposes without a great degree of clarity on what the impact of those cuts were going to be for the operations of those two departments. So that's a lot.
A lot,
but
Brandon.
That's just
all
trying
the
to
amendments got put in those bills.
trying to throw it all together into what got done in a special session.
Such a great recap. Thank you.
Sure.
We would love to extend the conversation to talk about what barriers were there to developing, discussing, and passing a tax relief bill.
Yeah, so this was from the folks who have been working with the legislature for a long time, the staff that have been there, maybe the lobbyists, senators who are familiar, the word unusual got used quite a bit. And so I think there were a lot of factors at play here. The first one that comes to mind is just what Rebecca mentioned earlier. This is a hugely complex issue. Property taxes and how they all play together with school funding and sales tax and income tax, and it's just really complex to address in such a short amount of time. So I think that was the first issue. One other issue that we can't overlook is the timing of a special session, particularly related to elections. So now that we're out of a regular session and we're the timing of the special session, we have a lot of folks who are running for election in the general. So there, some of the senators there were actually running for re-election for the seats they were sitting in, and we also have a few that were running for federal office. So that just changes the nature of the conversation, the optics, the process that senators are thinking through on multiple levels that they're considering when they're making policy. And then I think the third piece is that for some of our senators who are term limited, because we have term limits in Nebraska, this was their last opportunity to make a dent in this issue that a lot of them have been working on for a really long time. So I think all of those put together kind of changed the conversation, in addition to the fact that it's just a huge undertaking to look at.
Can I add on to that as well? Yes, as you said, that there's a lot of complexity to tax policy. So I see a real benefit of this special session, as I think we heard from a number of senators that they got a much deeper exposure to all of the complexities of tax policy and the sort of the implications of the decisions being made as a result of the special session, and that is a net positive. But tax policy, there's a lot of very intricate moving parts to it, and critically, one of the proposals that the main proposal coming into special session was looking at reducing the amount of property tax that school districts can collect and having the state come in and make up the difference. And because that would reduce the amount of property taxes that are collected in the state, and that would have solved the issue that many people were trying to address in the session. But then it raises a whole host of other potential consequences in terms of how do schools set their budgets, and if you are reducing the amount of property taxes that schools can collect, what's the guarantee that the state is going to be able to make up the difference in a sustainable basis? And where is that funding going to come from? And when you're doing all of this in a really condensed period of time, typically in a regular session, we are running models of every single major piece of tax policy. We are running budget projections out for 10 years to try to understand what this is going to mean for how much revenue the state is collecting, what is it going to mean for the state's bottom line. We had none of the time to do that. And I know that there were senators who they received bills that they were being asked to vote on, 122-page bill, and they got it the night before it was being debated on the floor of the legislature. So they had very little time to really pack through the nuances and make sure that they were making decisions that were responsive to their constituents. So it was complex. It's hard to do in a short period of time. And yes, as you said, there's a variety of other political implications of doing this really close to a general election.
Well, and I wondered a little bit too about I appreciate the point about hopefully people have learned more about how taxes work, but when we're in a regular session, there are other things going on. So it's easier to tie that. What does this actually mean? What do cuts actually mean to the programs that I'm trying to pass and bills and things like that? I think separating that also just adds a layer of complexity that's harder to really put your arms around what that's going to look like.
Yep. I would also say there were a number of folks who could have been at the table leading up to the special session in terms of developing the proposals that were really going to be debated thoroughly. So there was a working group of senators that had been working on proposals coming into the session. But when you are touching on how all of local governments pay for themselves, there were some other folks who could have been at the table to really shape some robust policy proposals.
Perfect, thank you. So we would love to know what happens now. Is there any education or distribution that needs to be done now that this bill has passed? Or will there be senators discussing more property tax relief in the off season? Do you have any?
You probably know more about that than I do.
I think we most certainly expect that there's going to be more discussion about property taxes and property tax relief to come in the regular session. I think now is an opportunity for folks who are running for election or re-election. You know, this is a great time for them to be talking with their constituents when they're knocking on doors and hearing from them. And then once we get through the election in November, I'm quite certain that there are a lot of senators who are going to be looking for new policy proposals.
And it sounds like the governor still would like to do more work because he didn't get quite to the level that he wanted to initially reach. So as far as people needing to do anything, particularly with the front loading of the taxes, there's nothing that people need to do differently. In fact, that will make that piece easier for the general public. So.
It should. I mean,
in theory.
In theory, I think, the implementation of policy is always a thing that the Department of Revenue and the counties are going to have to figure out how to make this policy change work. And I think as a taxpayer, it's always worthwhile to really be paying attention to how these programs working to make sure that you're understanding where your tax dollars are going.
Great points. Our next question reads, what are examples of other policies that could produce significant property tax relief? Do you have any in mind?
Yeah, there's actually a variety of proposals, some of which were discussed in the special session and some of which weren't. I would say the first thing is, again, if the state is going to be taking action on property tax relief, there's always going to be a price tag for the state. So there's a question of where's the pay for coming from, which on a state level means income taxes or sales taxes. So OpenSky's perspective on this is to ensure that there is sustainable and affordable property tax relief on the state level. It's important for that to be targeted to make sure that the state isn't taking on financial commitments that it can't sustain in the long run. There are a few things that could be explored. Expansions or rethinking of our homestead exemption, which are programs for eligible property owners to claim some exemption of their property taxes. I think there's a lot of work that could be done on our homestead exemption. We have done some research. I know there are some senators who talk about circuit breakers, which is basically for income constrained households that the state at a certain threshold would come in and sort of make up the difference in paying your property taxes. And the big thing is really taking a look at our school funding system, which has been around for 30 years and hasn't necessarily kept up with changes in the market. And then making sure that we have a robust top of the line system of paying for our K through 12 education that makes sure we have great student outcomes and make sure that we have a good mix of how much the state is kicking in and how much the local school districts are kicking in. That work on school funding is going to be really important.
Awesome. So our final question for you both is, how do people get involved in the work that you do, and what might that look like? Rachel, I'll start with you.
Yeah, so if this is an interesting conversation with us, clearly it is. If you have found this fascinating, there are others like you. So the League of Women Voters, like I mentioned, for the state level, we always are looking for people to be more educated about things, actually go down to the Capitol, listen to hearings, give testimony, talk to friends and family. You can find out more information at our website. And again, there's also those local opportunities as well. So the other piece with us is that we have action alerts that go out and kind of help people who are busy with their lives to know, when do I need to email a senator, when do I need to testify, and oftentimes we'll include a lot of the background so people really understand what's happening. And that often comes from OpenSky, we use frequently, so that's a natural segue to you.
Rachel. So our website is openskypolicy.org. And you can go to our website and you can sign up for our emails and get information about the policy analysis and research that we do. And I also wanted to put in a plug for our Fall Policy Symposium, which is coming up on September 18th and is open to the general public for anyone who's interested in learning more about state policy. We've got a great run-up of topics. We're going to be talking about housing policy and what the state can be doing to help with affordable housing. We're going to be talking about food security. We're going to spend a fair amount of time talking about K through 12 education, like how we pay for it and how we make it responsive to the needs of our families here in the state.
Sounds incredible. Well, thank you both for speaking with us and joining our program. Rachel and Rebecca, we appreciate your time with us. For the League of Women Voters of Greater Omaha, I'm Candide Santiago, reminding you to inform yourself about issues and candidates and to be ready to go vote Omaha.